Throughout Canada's young history, many LGBTQ individuals have been seriously and irreversibly harmed by the effects of conversion therapy. Many have fallen victim to a practice that is now widely understood to be horrific in nature and rooted in many false and prejudiced views against LGBTQ Canadians. I'm grateful to the constituents of my riding who respectfully engaged with me on this issue and shared their support of the banning of conversion therapy. To my constituents and to all Canadians, I assure you that I stand with you. Conversion therapy is wrong, and it must be banned. The concern I have with Bill C-6, and the concerns I've heard from literally hundreds of individuals who've reached out to me over the past few months, is that the bill would do much more than just ban conversion therapy. One of the fundamental flaws of this bill, and what is becoming a signature move of this government, is that it doesn't properly define what type of practices and services that the government is specifically trying to ban. As a result, its overbroad definition will end up criminalizing important support services and ironically end up hurting the very individuals that we are trying most to protect. Let me explain. One of the critical supports that this bill would ban is the open access to counseling to manage sexual behavior. Unlike every professional or medical institution in North America, this bill includes in its definition of conversion therapy, quote, any practice, treatment, or service designed to repress or reduce non-heterosexual behavior. Madam Speaker, we looked at 152 definitions of conversion therapy around the world, including the United Nations. And of all the governments that have passed a law or a bylaw on this issue, not a single one has used the definition of conversion therapy that is in this legislation. None of them included in their definition a ban on sexual behavior counseling, independent of orientation change. And I want to reiterate, because this is important, not one medical body or government in the world defines conversion therapy this way. None of them include in their definition a ban on sexual behavior counseling. So this is highly concerning, as the reality is that Canadians may want counseling to help reduce or change all kinds of behaviors, including sexual behavior. Yet the government's definition is written in such a way that it would negatively impact equal access to counseling for LGBTQ individuals, as no counselor would be allowed to help repress or reduce non-heterosexual behavior. Let's take, for example, an individual struggling with a heterosexual porn addiction or the compulsive desire to have an extramarital heterosexual affair. They can go get counseling to help manage their sex addictions, while a homosexual individual wanting counseling to manage the same behaviors would not be able to access that support. Madam Speaker, I think we can both agree that that's discrimination. No individual should be prevented from getting the mental and/or behavioral supports that they want. In fact, most Canadians agree. A NANOS poll conducted earlier this year reported that 91% of Canadians support the right of Canadians to get the counseling of their choice, regardless of sexual orientation. That's 91% of Canadians who don't think anyone should be discriminated against for getting the help that they want. And Canadians are raising their voices of concern on this. The Justice Committee heard numerous testimonies and received dozens of expert briefs explaining what they called chill effect, where regardless of any assurances from the federal government, no counselor would want to help LGBTQ individuals manage their behaviors for fear of breaking the law and sacrificing their careers. They also said that even if a counselor was willing to discreetly provide such services to the LGBTQ community, these professionals would be difficult to find, given that the bill also makes a criminal of anyone who knowingly promotes or advertises an offer to provide conversion therapy. By definition, promotes or advertises would include a word-of-mouth referral by a parent or pastor to a counselor who provides these services. And this reality of a chill effect on counseling has already caused serious concern to a young man who wrote to my office, and he said the following. I am happily married to an amazing woman, the love of my life, and I am a father to 2 beautiful children, with another on the way. I am also attracted to men. In order to find the most fulfillment in my married life, I decided, with the support of my wife, to get counseling to help me manage my same-sex attractions. This has been a huge benefit to me and my family at large. My concern with Bill C-6 is that its scope is so large that it would criminalize the conversations that I freely sought out. Why should I be prevented from being able to access the help that I need so I can pursue the sexual identity and the relationships that I choose? And so, Madam Speaker, I believe it's critical that the definition of this legislation gets in line with all other medical bodies in North America. It is the role of the government to ban bad practices, but not to decide what identity or behaviors an individual should realize. That freedom should be left to the individual. I fully support a ban that focuses on harmful medical practices, but not on one that attacks Canadians' freedom to choose their outcomes and goals. I also want to speak to the very real concern that this bill would cast a dark shadow on free and open conversations between parents, teachers, and clergy with their dependents. I know firsthand that children reaching adolescence often have many questions regarding sexuality and gender, but Bill C-6 would basically allow Big Brother into the home and church, into the synagogue or the mosque, and it would bar parents and spiritual leaders from providing the guidance and direction that children and teens need, especially when they're in such a vulnerable and malleable stage in life. Parents in particular have rights and responsibilities toward their children, which includes the right to guide and direct them in accordance with their own worldview. We are entering dangerous territory with this legislation, where the government is telling parents what they may or may not say to their children. While we need to work towards an even-handed approach that protects the rights of the LGBTQ community and protects children from potential abusive therapies, we also need to protect the rights of all Canadians to hold their own perspectives on sexuality and raise their children in accordance with these views. Again, the Justice Committee received hundreds of briefs from different faith communities, all expressing this concern. But I have to wonder if the Justice Minister has even read a single one of those briefs, because the Justice Committee sure didn't. I was extremely disappointed that instead of taking the time to carefully consider the record number of public submissions, the government decided to rush this legislation through committee study before those briefs could even be translated for consideration. They did not even bother to go over or elaborate on the evidence received by the committee or the testimonies of the witnesses. Instead, the report suggested a small handful of minor edits that in no way address the concerns of those who are opposed to the legislation. Madam Speaker, that is why I'm grateful to be able to speak today and bring to light the concerns of Canadians that the government refuses to address. That is why we as Conservatives put forward an amendment to the legislation that would protect these private conversations. Our amendment even used language pulled directly from the government's own website, but still, they refuse to support it. So I have to ask the Minister of Justice if he was willing to acknowledge this concern on his website and provide clarification. Why isn't he willing to do the same on the actual piece of legislation? He and I both know that an explanatory note on a government website won't convince the courts when this issue gets challenged, because judges do not refer to a website when making a ruling. They're going to look at and they're going to use the terms that have been laid out in this piece of legislation that we are debating here today. So before I could support this bill, I believe it needs to make very clear that good faith conversations where personal views on sexual orientation, sexual feelings, sexual behavior, or gender identity are expressed, such as where teachers, school counselors, pastoral counselors, faith leaders, doctors, mental health professionals, friends or family members respectfully provide support to persons with respect to sexual orientation, sexual feelings, or gender identity are protected. Finally, in my time remaining, I want to touch on what I believe is perhaps the most damaging in this bill, and that is its conflation of gender identity and sexual orientation. Speaker, these are two very different issues, and treating them as the same in this piece of legislation will undoubtedly have many harmful effects on Canadians. While identifying as gay or lesbian at a young age may not have any biological consequence, choosing to identify as transgender does, and irreversibly so if chemical and surgical transition follow. Few young children have the cognitive capacity to state with certainty that they are transgender, and yet Bill C-6 makes no distinction between 17-year-olds and 7-year-olds. Any move on the part of parents or counselors to simply encourage children to be comfortable in their own bodies or to practice watchful waiting could be a criminal offense under this bill. Isn't something out of place here, where parental consent is required to allow a child to join a field trip or to get a tattoo, but when it comes to changing their gender, the child has full authority? Madam Speaker, I have 3 wonderful children. They're bright kids, but I assure you that 9 times out of 10, they don't know what's best for themselves. And simply put, that's why my wife and I are their guardians until they're adults and until they've reached an age where they have the cognitive capacity to be able to make permanent and life-altering decisions, such as having a surgical procedure or having a chemical treatment done, or having certain treatments done that do have a permanent and long-lasting effect on their life. So why then would we pass legislation that would allow children as young as 5 years old to make these irreversible decisions on their own? It's becoming increasingly clear that the majority of children with questions about their gender identity eventually grow comfortable with their biological gender, and their dysphoria desists after some time. That's why watchful waiting has been used by some health professionals and experts as a way to see if what they're experiencing is a temporary phase in the child's life, or if the dysphoria persists over a period of time. Watchful waiting allows parents and professionals to understand the particular circumstances of a child experiencing gender dysphoria and give them the opportunity to naturally desist or see if their gender dysphoria persists. But you may ask, why encourage watchful waiting? If a child wants to transition, why stop or delay their ability to do so? Well, the reality is, should the child's dysphoria desist, and down the road they identify with their biological gender, the path back isn't so easy. Many transition therapies have long and irreversible consequences. Dr. Deborah So, a neuroscientist and sex researcher who earned her PhD from York University, wrote the following article for Kiet back in 2018. She said, and I'll quote, "Therapy that seeks to help gender dysphoric children go comfortable in their birth sex, known in the research literature as the therapeutic approach, has been conflated with conversion therapy, but this is inaccurate. All of the available research showing gender dysphoric children longitudinally shows that the majority desist. They outgrow their feelings of dysphoria by puberty and grow up to be gay in adulthood, not transgender. Children will say they are the opposite sex because that's the only language they have to express to adults that they want to do things the opposite sex does. Cross-sex behavior has also been shown to be a strong predictor of homosexuality in men. Previous research tells us that even children who are severe in their feelings of dysphoria will desist." End quote there. And yet, C6 as written treats the likelihood of gender dysphoric children desisting as an impossibility or as somehow wrong. Ms. Lisa Bildy, a lawyer from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, warned the Justice Committee that the bill as written forces a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with gender dysphoric children, rushing to affirm a child's purported gender identity. As she testified, cautious, measured approaches are not the danger. Rather, she says, and I'll quote again, "A free society that supports individual rights, as Canada is supposed to be, would allow parents, children, and health professionals to find the best path for each unique child, not have the state preordain that transition is the only permissible option." End quote. But if you don't want to hear it from the experts, let's listen to what Canadians think. The same Nanos poll I referenced earlier found that 72% of Canadians support a wait-and-see approach for counseling young people who are thinking about changing their bodies with drug treatment. That's a vast majority of Canadians who support a therapeutic approach that this bill would ban. It's clear to me that most Canadians understand that the push for the immediate affirmation and transition of all gender dysphoric children is dangerous. If we encourage all children struggling with their gender identity to transition, we run the risk of them eventually undergoing medical procedures that are irreversible without a sober second thought, because such thought will have been criminalized with Bill C-6. We would do well to learn from the mistakes being made by those countries leading in the progressive charge. Just last December, the British High Court ruled that children under 16 do not have the capacity to consent to life-changing transition surgeries. This case was the result of a growing number of lawsuits from transitioners who have come to regret their decision to transition at a young age and are now arguing that the government didn't properly protect their vulnerability. In the ruling, the High Court argued that children under 16 did not have the ability to understand the long-term consequences of receiving puberty-blocking drugs and banned them from receiving such treatment. Other European countries are now moving in that direction as well. In contrast, here in Canada, Bill C-6 would effectively prevent young people from receiving help to accept their biological gender, even if they want it. To be clear, the ban in this legislation would allow for any minor to get counseling and support to transition away from their biological sex, but they would not be allowed to get counseling that would help them identify with their biological sex, even if they wanted that help. Madam Speaker, I think we're going down a dangerous path here, and it's a path that other countries have already gone down and have come to regret. We need to stand up for all children and all their specific needs, and that is what I'm seeking to do here, in standing up to speak to the one-directional, or rather one-size-fits-all approach of this legislation. To conclude, I want to end my speech where I started, by reiterating that I support a conversion therapy ban. However, I do not support the ban that is written in this legislation. It is far too broad and will end up hurting the very people we are trying most to protect. Everyone has a right to be treated with the utmost dignity and respect, but it is precisely because of this right that we should not criminalize legitimate therapies designed to help patients explore their sexual identity and/or gender identity. While the government's intentions with this bill may be pure, their attempt to eliminate an evil is fundamentally flawed and will have far-reaching negative consequences. And Madam Speaker, for these reasons, I cannot support this bill as written. I urge the government to go back to the drawing board and get this legislation right for the sake of the LGBTQ community and for all Canadians. Thank you.